Eva Carter stepped out of the black SUV, taking a deep breath as she glanced up at the flight information board. JFK Airport was more crowded than ever that morning. Announcements echoed through the terminals, and travelers hurried past, dragging their rolling suitcases across the polished floors. She tightened her grip on her ticket. This flight wasn't just taking her to Chicago. It was taking her one step closer to her dream. A spot at an elite basketball training camp, not because of her father's name, Derek Carter, the NBA legend, but because she had worked relentlessly to earn this opportunity. Aiva approached the check-in counter with confidence, but the moment she placed her ticket on the counter, the airline agent, Lisa, gave her a slow, scrutinizing look from head to toe. There was nothing welcoming about it. Business class? Lisa arched an eyebrow. Are you sure? Aiva nodded, keeping her voice calm. Yes, that's correct. Lisa lowered her voice, though still loud enough for others to hear. These tickets are pretty expensive. Who bought it for you? The air suddenly grew heavy. A chill ran down Ava's spine. She recognized that look. Doubt. Suspicion. I have all my documents, Aiva said, suppressing the frustration rising in her chest. Lisa picked up the ticket, staring at the computer screen, pressing her lips together as if searching for something to be wrong. I need to see your ID again. Aiva swallowed hard and handed over her driver's license. Lisa took it, examining it for far longer than necessary. Ava's heart pounded. This was only the beginning. But something told her. Things were about to get worse. She clenched the strap of her backpack as Lisa finally shoved her ID back across the counter, giving her one last skeptical glance. Gate C14, boarding in an hour, Lisa said, her tone cold, almost dismissive. Aiva inhaled deeply, trying to push down the uneasy feeling creeping into her chest. She was used to the stares, the whispers when people found out she was Derek Carter's daughter. But this time, she hadn't even mentioned his name. She wanted to prove herself on her own terms. Yet, it seemed like the world wasn't going to make it easy for her. She pulled her suitcase toward the security checkpoint, where a long line of passengers waited their turn. A middle-aged man in a suit stood in front of her, eyes glued to his phone. Behind her, a family with 2 young children played and giggled. Everything seemed normal, until she stepped through the scanner. A loud beep echoed. A TSA officer, a man in his 40s with a stern expression, gestured for her to stop. Ma'am, step back and go through again, he instructed. Aiva frowned but did as she was told. Another beep. The officer exchanged looks with his colleague before crossing his arms. We need to conduct additional screening. Please step over here. Aiva bit her lip, feeling the weight of strangers' eyes on her as she was pulled aside. The officers began going through her backpack, pulling out her sneakers, her jersey, a water bottle, even her basketball playbook. One of them held up her sneakers and raised an eyebrow. Basketball, huh? What team do you play for? Aiva kept her voice steady. I'm attending a training camp in Chicago. The man nodded but smirked slightly. Hope you're as good as your father. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had heard this before. People always assumed she was only here because of her father's name, not because of her own talent. But what happened next was even worse. Another TSA officer stepped forward, pulling out a device to scan her hands and clothes, checking for traces of explosives or prohibited substances. This is ridiculous, Aiva muttered under her breath, but she didn't resist. She glanced at the clock. 15 minutes had passed, and they still wouldn't let her go. Other passengers, none of whom looked any wealthier than she did, were being processed in mere seconds. Finally, after finding nothing, one of the officers let out a sigh and shoved everything back into her bag without so much as an apology. Next time, try arriving earlier, he said, his tone patronizing. Aiva didn't reply. She simply hoisted her backpack over her shoulder and walked away without looking back. But just when she thought the ordeal was over, it wasn't. When Aiva reached Gate C14, a small group of airline staff stood huddled together. Then, a man in a black suit, Mark, the airline supervisor, stepped forward, blocking her path. Are you Aiva Carter? She stopped short. Yes. Mark crossed his arms, his expression sharp and unreadable. We've received an alert that your ticket may have been issued incorrectly or is potentially invalid. I'll need you to present your identification and payment method again. Aiva felt her face grow hot. I've already done that. My ticket is completely valid. Mark shook his head. We need further verification. Please come with me. She looked around, feeling the weight of passengers' eyes following her every move. A slow, simmering anger rose in her chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This was discrimination. And Aiva knew this wasn't even the worst of it yet. She bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to stay composed as Mark stepped aside, gesturing for her to follow. More whispers spread through the crowd. A few people pulled out their phones, likely recording the interaction. She clenched the strap of her backpack, reminding herself not to show weakness. But inside, frustration burned. Mark led her to a separate area near the customer service desk, where a female airline agent sat behind a computer already waiting. Aiva didn't sit down. Instead, she crossed her arms, standing tall. I've shown my ID. I've passed security. And now you're saying my ticket is an issue. Exactly how many more hoops do I have to jump through before I'm allowed to board? Her voice was firm, cutting through the tension. Mark remained unmoved, tilting his head slightly. We're simply following protocol. Your ticket was purchased with a credit card under the name Derek Carter. We need to confirm this wasn't a fraudulent transaction. Aiva's hands balled into fists. Fraud? She unlocked her phone, scrolled to the airline's confirmation email, and held up the screen. This is the official confirmation from your airline, along with the receipt. Everything checks out. Mark didn't even glance at it. He merely shrugged. Anyone can fake an email. Aiva felt her chest tighten. This wasn't about the ticket. I'm not faking anything. I'm Derek Carter's daughter. He bought this ticket for me. The moment the words left her mouth, Aiva knew she had made a mistake. Mark's eyes narrowed before a slow, skeptical smirk spread across his face. Oh, so now you're saying you're Derek Carter's daughter? He let out a quiet chuckle. Right. Who wouldn't want to claim they're the child of an NBA legend? Aiva froze. He didn't believe her. You see the problem here? Mark continued, his tone sharp and condescending. We can't allow a passenger to board with a ticket flagged for potential fraud. If this is legitimate, you can have the cardholder verify it in person. Aiva's grip tightened around her phone. What do you mean? You're saying my father has to come here physically to prove I'm not a fraud? Mark gave a careless shrug. If that's the case, then it shouldn't take too long, should it? That was the final straw. Aiva couldn't believe this. She had been held up, humiliated, and now they wanted her father to show up in person just to prove she deserved a business-class seat? Her pulse pounded as she unlocked her phone, her fingers trembling with anger. She hit call. The line rang only once before her father's deep, steady voice came through. Hey, baby girl. You getting ready to board? Aiva closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. When she spoke, her voice shook, not with fear, but with sheer frustration. Dad, they're not letting me on the plane. Silence, then a single word. What? They said I have to prove I'm actually your daughter. Otherwise, they're canceling my ticket. On the other end of the line, Derek's breathing slowed. When he spoke again, his voice was low, controlled, but beneath it was something dangerous. Where are you? Aiva scanned her surroundings, her jaw clenched. Customer service desk, near gate C14. Derek was silent for a moment. Then he said just one sentence. Stay right there, I'm on my way. Aiva lowered her phone, her fingers gripping it tightly. Mark crossed his arms, smirking. Oh, so we're about to meet the great Derek Carter? She didn't answer. But deep inside, she knew one thing. Mark was about to regret everything he had just done. Aiva stood her ground, still clutching her phone. She could feel her heart pounding, not out of fear, but from the anger that had been simmering inside her since the moment she stepped into the airport. Mark remained where he was, arms crossed, his expression sharp and unwavering, as if he thought this was just some bluff. The other airline employees shifted uncomfortably, some glancing away, avoiding Aiva's gaze. The minutes dragged on. Around her, passengers continued checking in, boarding their flights, going about their business as if nothing was happening. But Aiva stood still, frozen in a space where she didn't belong. And then it happened. A sleek black SUV screeched to a stop outside the terminal doors. Nearby travelers turned to look. The car door swung open, and Derek Carter stepped out. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. Towering over most of the crowd, Derek Carter moved with effortless authority, his athletic frame clad in a simple tracksuit. His long strides carried him through the terminal with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the space. Whispers spread like wildfire. People began recognizing him. A few pulled out their phones, capturing the moment. Aiva felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had never needed her father to fight her battles. She had spent her whole life trying to prove herself beyond his name. But right now, just having him there meant everything. Mark, who had been so smug just minutes ago, suddenly straightened his posture. The confidence on his face began to fade. Derek reached Aiva in just a few strides, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. His gaze, sharp as steel, locked onto Mark. "Who is responsible for stopping my daughter from boarding her flight?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to freeze the air around them. Mark swallowed hard but tried to maintain a professional tone. "Mr. Carter, there was an issue with your daughter's ticket. We needed to verify the payment because—" Derek lifted a hand. "No need to hear another word. Her ticket is valid. My name is on it. You can check your system, call your headquarters, do whatever you need to do, but the facts won't change." He tilted his chin toward Aiva. "She's not a fraud. She doesn't need to prove to anyone that she deserves the seat I paid for." Mark opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. The tension grew thicker, heavy enough that a few nearby employees began stepping back, distancing themselves from the confrontation. Then Derek took a step forward, his voice slow, deliberate, but every word carried undeniable authority. "The only thing that needs to be verified here is why you chose to treat my daughter this way." Mark blinked, struggling to form a response, but he had none. Derek held his gaze, his sharp eyes cutting through the silence like a blade. "If she wasn't my daughter, if she wasn't a young black woman, would you have done the same to any other passenger?" No one spoke. No one dared to. The weight of his words hung in the air. People around them were starting to understand what was really happening. A higher-ranking airline official, possibly Mark's superior, hurried over, his face tight with panic. "We sincerely apologize, Mr. Carter. This was a misunderstanding." Aiva looked up, her eyes filled with something almost amused. "A misunderstanding?" Mark stood there, hands clenched at his sides, but he had nothing left to say. The senior manager quickly handed Aiva's boarding pass back, his voice practically dripping with desperation. "We will escort Miss Carter to the gate immediately. There will be no further delays." Derek didn't move. He just stood there, silently observing, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low and razor-sharp, Derek spoke. "The ticket was never the issue. Respect was." Mark lowered his head, unable to respond. Aiva gripped her boarding pass tightly. But this time, relief was the last thing she felt. She wasn't upset because she had almost missed her flight. She wasn't even angry about the wasted time. She was angry because if her father hadn't been Derek Carter, if he hadn't shown up in person, she might never have been allowed to board that plane. And that was what she couldn't accept. As she stood at the boarding gate, her fingers still clutched the ticket, not just as a passage to Chicago, but as proof of something much bigger. Derek Carter looked at his daughter, his eyes softening. He knew Aiva had never wanted him to step in. She had always wanted to prove herself without relying on his name. But sometimes, silence and patience weren't the right answers. "You okay?" Derek asked gently. Aiva nodded, but something in her eyes told him the answer wasn't that simple. As she stepped through the jet bridge, a flight attendant greeted her with a forced smile. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Miss Carter. We hope you have a comfortable flight." Aiva met her gaze but didn't respond. She found her seat, fastened her seatbelt, and stared out the window. The plane began taxiing toward the runway. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Text me when you land. Don't let this bring you down. Show them who you are." A small smile crossed Aiva's lips. Yes, she wouldn't let this define her. She wasn't flying to Chicago to prove something to people like Mark. She was going there to prove something to herself. As the plane lifted off the ground, Aiva closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her journey was only just beginning. What do you think about the way Derek Carter stood up for his daughter? If you ever faced an unfair situation, how would you handle it? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.